Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is Benjamin Gedan. Benjamin is Senior Advisor with the Wilson Center's Latin American program and also Director of its Argentina Project. And he joins us today to talk about a red-hot topic, Venezuela and the goings-on in Venezuela. And I should say, Benjamin, to you and to our viewers and listeners, that we understand the volatility of this situation. As we tape this discussion, record this discussion, things could be changing in real time. So we'll try to be aware of that, but the world keeps spinning in spite of our production schedule. So with this notion of the volatility of the situation, could you give us a brief summary of where we stand at this hour?
Sure. I mean, again, we're at an inflection point with Venezuela day by day, hour by hour, even minute by minute, because a lot depends on the mobilization of the Venezuelan people. The international community has been the big story of late. As you know, under the current president of Venezuela, there was a great deal of pressure to redemocratize what had been one of the wealthiest and democratic countries in Latin America. As of January 10th, the inauguration after a fraudulent election last May, that pressure really crested. And the international community essentially said, we've had enough. Emerging from Venezuela was a new opposition headliner who was able to coalesce not only the people, but also the fractious opposition movement. So again, we find ourselves really in what we haven't seen in a decade, which is a moment where political change may be possible.
This momentum that you describe, how long has it been building?
It's been building in some sense for years as the country has deteriorated. I mean, I think as Venezuelans have left by the millions, more than 3 million in the past few years, the biggest migration crisis in recent Latin American history, has created the conditions for some kind of upheaval. What we haven't seen, however, is enough of a mobilization internally to turn the tide. What has changed is the international community has really decided it's had enough.
So this tipping point that occurred, they always, when they happen, appear to happen all at once. But as you just described, it's been happening for years. But what the 11th hour sort of, what were the things that finally pushed this to a point where now you have an interim president and over 20 nations recognizing this new government while Nicolas Maduro still sits in the president's office? How did we get to that moment where all hell broke loose?
Yeah, I think you had an opportunity for a new figure to emerge from the Venezuelan opposition and say that the government clearly has no legitimacy. These were claims that were made for years as civil society space contracted in Venezuela. But because you had an election widely discredited last May, once the inauguration came around, you had countries able to step up and say, okay, this is a dictatorship.
So that's
clearly.
The catalyst, the sense of a fraudulent election?
It is, and the inauguration of that fraudulently elected figure January 10th.
So what about the impact of U.S. sanctions? How big of a hurt is this putting on the Maduro government?
The sanctions have mostly, up to this point, been on individuals. So they have tried to fracture the elite inner circle in Venezuela and tried to punish wrongdoers for human rights abuses, cocaine trafficking, and the erosion of civil liberties and democratic institutions. Now what we have is quite different. We now have sanctions against the Venezuelan oil industry. That's the lifeblood of the Venezuelan government. And if these sanctions have the impact we think they might, it really could collapse the government.
So just being a strong man hasn't been enough to raise the ire of this president, who has shown an affinity for strong men around the country, even in autocratic regimes like North Korea. So what is it about Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela that has made the U.S. so hostile to this leader and this country?
It's a great question, frankly. This is probably the biggest mystery, other than the direction of Venezuela, is the motivations of the Trump administration. As you point out, it is not known as a great defender of human rights and democratic institutions. It has had quite tolerance, if not an affinity, for dictatorial regimes. In this case, there's lots of hypotheses. It could be electoral politics in Florida, where you have a big Venezuelan expat community. It could be that the Hugo Chavez, the predecessor of the current dictator in Venezuela, who's a bête noire for the Republican Party in the United States. It could be the consensus on Capitol Hill. Democrats also don't approve of the Venezuelan authorities. In that case, it's mostly because of the human rights and democratic backsliding.
What is the risk of this escalating into something violent? We're recording this discussion on January 29th. Yesterday, on January 28th, John Bolton has this notepad that has a notation about 5,000 troops, which has led to all kinds of speculation on whether this was a purposeful mistake by Mr. Bolton or whether it was just an outright mistake. How close are we to something that involves military action?
I think there's a lot of violent scenarios, unfortunately, that could play out. One of them is insurrection. So far, the protests in Venezuela have been quite peaceful and have been seeking a democratic transition. At any moment, those protests and demonstrations themselves could catalyze violence. The response could be quite violent. You have the National Guard, which is ruthless and notorious in Venezuela, that could crack down, as the security services have. You could have the military in a point of having to decide whether to repress protesters in a way that could create a civil war.
U.S. diplomats at risk.
U.S. diplomats at risk. They're unwelcome in the country now. There has been some grace period where they're going to negotiate their exit or not and see how the U.S. responds. And then there's the scenario that you bring up, which has been threatened for a long time by the Trump administration, but now appears more serious and in search of a catalyst, which is an actual U.S. invasion.
What is the read of the neighboring countries? How is this being received regionally?
So I think the best way to fracture the regional coalition is to have the United States invade. I think they may be getting some mixed signals from the new governments in Colombia and particularly in Brazil that there might be some private, at least, tolerance of a U.S. military engagement, in part because of the massive burden that these Venezuelan outflows have imposed on those governments. You're talking about maybe half of these 3 million Venezuelans residing now in Colombia. Because of those burdens, fiscal and political, there may be more openness to the kinds of U.S. unilateral interventions that normally the region would say, no, please no. In this case, however, I still think the reaction would be highly negative.
Benjamin, what do you think is the key moment for Nicolas Maduro? Is it public support? Is it the military's allegiance? What would be the thing that would finally cause him to say it's time to leave?
So the military could depose Maduro in a minute, and it wouldn't have to be in a dramatic, historical, Latin American style coup. It would simply be going on television and saying, we now recognize these interim authorities and we will participate in an election process. That would be it. I don't think he would be able to hang on for even a moment. Short of that, it would have to be massive and prolonged, sustained protests that we haven't seen. We've seen quite courageously Venezuelans fill the streets and public squares. We've even seen them stay for days or weeks in 2017 and 2015. But I think at this point, it would probably be a combination where the military decides that this regime cannot last and they want to be on the right side of history.
I know we don't traffic in pure speculation, but I have to ask you your thoughts on how this is likely to play out.
Yeah, I think people have been predicting the collapse of the government in Venezuela for years, and understandably so, given the fragility of the economy, hyperinflation, the disgust with this government among Venezuelans. Now, they've had some outs, right? They've had the pressure valve of out-migration. No one would have expected over 3 million Venezuelans to leave in this short a period of time. They've had some bailouts from the Chinese. They've had help from the Russians, now the Turks. So there have been reasons that they've been able to hang on, but just by a thread. At this point now, you really are having this concert of actors and pressures all at once. How it will play out, I don't know, but I would say that the government is under pressure that it has not seen ever.
Do you think it could become semi-chronic when you could have two people claiming leadership of the country?
It certainly could. I mean, I think the international community is trying to wave a magic wand and create a new government in Venezuela that has created some interesting diplomacy, but it doesn't create meaningful change on the ground. The government of Venezuela, as fragile as it is, has complete control over territory and the use of force.
Mm-hmm. So, longer-term outlook. Let's not speculate on how this crisis resolves itself, but let's assume that with hope that it will resolve itself. What's the outlook for Venezuela then? It has oil riches and other things to fall back on. Can the country turn it around?
I think so. I mean, there are skeptics who say that the rebuilding necessary will require such amount of international support that the Trump administration, which is not very favorable toward foreign assistance, the IMF, which may not have adequate resources, that to put it back on its feet is going to be very difficult. There's also the idea of divisions within Venezuela. A third of the country still supports the ideology of the government, if not the government itself. You have these militias known as colectivos who are armed and could potentially mount an insurgency of some sort. The infrastructure's collapsed, energy, water systems, the health system, scarcities of food, not to mention the lifeblood of the economy, the oil sector has declining production. That's the negative view. I'm actually optimistic. This is once the richest country in Latin America, a country with a robust democratic system and great institutions. It has lost a lot of Venezuelans who will come back and reverse the brain drain, and it has the biggest oil reserves in the world. With a few friends, I think it could recover relatively quickly.
We don't often get to end on an optimistic note, so I'm going to pounce on that and end on that note. And if you'd like more information on this, come to wilsoncenter.org. Benjamin has been prolific with a combination of interviews, op-eds, and keeping on top of this story. So thanks for joining us today and providing this excellent briefing, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And to all of you joining us, thanks again. Hope you'll join us for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.